And now, for our keynote speaker, I'm just going to briefly introduce her. Dr. Marsha Barrett is an assistant professor of history at the University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign. Her research examines the political and social history of the United States during the 20th century. Dr. Barrett's book, Nelson Rockefeller's Dilemma, The Fight to Save Moderate Republicanism, published by Cornell University Press, examines Rockefeller's career as a means for understanding the fate of moderate republicanism and the broader transformation of the political landscape after the passage of the 1960s federal civil rights legislation. Her research has appeared in publications, including our own New York History Journal, on whose advisory board she currently sits, the Journal of Policy History, Politico, and Time. Dr. Barrett has received national media attention for her new book. Barrett has been interviewed about the book on the Chuck Todd cast by Chuck Todd, a former host of NBC's show Meet the Press. She has also been interviewed on the New York Times TV show The Close-Up about the book. Additionally, Barrett has been interviewed about the 1968 Democratic National Convention on CBS Mornings, BBC, and NPR's All Things Considered. We are so fortunate to have her join us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marsha Barrett.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming to hear my keynote this evening. I'm really honored to be here this evening. This really is wonderful. I want to thank the NYCH Program Committee, Devin Lander and Jennifer Lamack for inviting me to participate in giving me this opportunity to give a talk in the Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller Empire State Plaza. I was reminded of how long that name is. I was looking at the street signs as I came in today. A conference entitled Constructing the Empire State, Innovation, Environment, and Imagination in New York History is the perfect venue to discuss Nelson Rockefeller. His 4-term, 15-year career as governor from 1959 to 1973 left an indelible mark on the state that is most starkly on display in downtown Albany. His administration crisscrossed the state with new highways, state parks, and university buildings. I just want to share a few statistics to give you a sense of the scope of his administration. So during his time in office, the State University of New York became the largest public university in the world, which expanded from 41 campuses that served 38,000 students in 1959 to 72 campuses with 232,000 full-time students in 1973. His administration established the nation's largest medical care program for low-income recipients under Medicaid, built or rebuilt 22,000 miles of highway. So transportation, you could give an entire talk about transportation, Nelson Rockefeller, certainly. The administration founded the nation's first state council on the arts and built 55 new state parks. So as I was preparing for my talk today, I broke out my copy of the public papers of Nelson Rockefeller from 1973. So this is the portrait that you see if you open that final record of his time in office. And one of the last sections is entitled The Rockefeller Record, right, Legacy of Leadership. That's where I got some of those stats that I shared with you. There's a long list after this first page. But I did want to highlight a note that makes me chuckle. Let me see if hitting the wrong button here. At the end of that list of historic high points, Empire State Plaza, America's most beautiful state capital. I'm sure that is an unbiased conclusion, but I do enjoy that. So I had to take a moment to share that with you. Maybe we could have a conversation about what your thoughts are when this is over. So to begin, I invite you all to set aside the present-day Republican Party to understand the Republican worldview of Nelson Rockefeller. By and large, the mid-20th century Republican Party was dominated by economic and social conservatives who sought to create a pro-business environment. They opposed the social safety net and supported a robust national security apparatus around the world. Within the grand old party, however, there was some heterodoxy. And I'll stop to say here for a moment too, if you have a chance to look at the cover of my book, you'll see that photograph of Nelson Rockefeller with Lincoln in the background. That was not a work of Photoshop. That was a photograph I found at the Rockefeller Archive Center, which is in Sleepy Hollow. One of my last visits there, I had a list with me of every single Lincoln Day dinner talk that Nelson Rockefeller gave, and then I checked every single day to see are there any pictures. And this is there's a series of him in Oregon, so that's where this photo comes from. So if you were curious and see the cover, I wanted to show you that. So it gives you also a sense of why thinking about Rockefeller and the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln really was central to who Nelson Rockefeller was and what he aspired for in terms of what the Republican Party would become, he hoped, right, if he could be the standard bearer, right, and maybe perhaps a president. So I define Rockefeller as a moderate Republican first because he rejected the labels of liberal and conservative, but second because he was part of a generation of mid-20th century Republicans who believed government should be at the center of Americans' lives, managing and mediating change, to borrow the phrasing used by this year's conference planners. And just to give you another image here. This is from the Dwight Eisenhower Presidential Library. We'll see Rockefeller in the back there behind Oveta Culp-Hobby, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So moderate Republicans spanned the political spectrum from Dwight Eisenhower to Nelson Rockefeller or Jacob Javits and embraced different labels. Eisenhower referred to himself as a modern Republican. While there were degrees of difference between these politicians, like Rockefeller, they believed it was best for local and state governments to lead. But when a problem was too big for an individual or a state, it should be mediated by the federal government. This was particularly important to Rockefeller as a means to wage the Cold War at home and abroad. Rockefeller was a Cold Warrior who supported a robust American presence around the world through foreign aid and military might. This embrace of an activist government was central to Rockefeller's approach to leadership and governance. It is also at the core of his efforts to remake the Republican Party at the height of the civil rights movement. Rockefeller's proposed innovation was to revive the Republican Party's 19th century identity as the party of Abraham Lincoln, a premier defender of African American rights, to meet the demands of the 20th century. He wanted the Republican Party to partner with the civil rights movement of the 1960s and aid the nation in becoming a multiracial democracy. For Rockefeller, this was essential for the nation to be its most productive and lead on the world stage effectively. Racism, segregation, and inequality were problems in Rockefeller's mind too big and too important to be left to individuals and states, whether that be in the South or North, and led him to be one of the nation's most prominent elected officials who supported federal civil rights legislation. When his peers in both major parties attenuated their support for civil rights activism or claimed that such activism was anti-American, communist, and lawless, Rockefeller spoke up proudly for the efforts to end the two-tier society in America. So I want to share a few examples with you so you get a sense of, right, his commitment to civil rights and how he thought about this issue. So before entering electoral politics, Rockefeller made his position on civil rights well known. During a gathering of the National Urban League in the fall of 1957, for example, Rockefeller argued that it was not enough to eliminate individuals' prejudices. Instead, he said it was necessary to provide, quote, positive leadership to overcome prejudices in the economic, social, and political institutions with which we are associated. In this period, he also said the nation must accelerate its efforts to make full civil rights and equal opportunity for all men a reality in our country. He continued his calls for enhanced civil rights protections in the state of New York when he campaigned for the governorship in 1958. I'll share a quote from that era. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. We cannot rewrite the laws of Arkansas, but we can embark on a bold program to solve the problems of our own state. We have a proud record of combating prejudice based on race, creed, and color. We have pioneered in social programs and legal programs to overcome discrimination. Rockefeller's civil rights plan for New York was to, first, intensify efforts to end discrimination in employment, housing, and education. Second, develop a new and positive approach to civil rights based on human potentialities. And third, he said, develop bolder programs for elimination of slums and expansion of housing opportunities in essentially segregated urban spaces, urban areas. Once in office, Rockefeller pledged to support efforts to outlaw discrimination in private housing in New York. He told a gathering of the NAACP, quote, I want to be counted in the forefront of this crusade for full equality and civil rights for every citizen, end quote. Rockefeller's initial attempt failed in the face of Republican opposition and arguments from Republican legislators that there was no discrimination in the state. Eventually, Rockefeller found success in 1961, but he had to reduce the scope of the bill to gain support from fellow Republicans. He didn't want to be embarrassed that this grand piece of legislation that he came up with would only get Democrat support, so he pivoted. Eventually, Rockefeller found success in 1961, but the state leadership of the NAACP, which had been working on the issue for decades, refused to support the bill, calling it a symbolic victory. In the midst of his activism on the state level during the 1960 presidential campaign, Rockefeller ensured that the party platform that Richard Nixon ran on essentially matched the Democratic Party's pledge to support civil rights activism and called for equality of opportunity to extend beyond the vote to include housing, education, and employment. Rockefeller ensured that both parties offered support for civil rights through federal legislation and executive action. As in New York, when he took on the issue of fair housing, he faced considerable opposition from Republicans who wanted to abandon the GOP's traditional ties to efforts to guarantee the rights of African Americans. Rockefeller's efforts fit well within Republican traditions, however, that dated back to the party's founding. But at the very same time, there was an effort in the 1960s to break with those traditional Republican commitments and reorient the GOP as, at the most extreme, an opponent to desegregation and civil rights protections, or, more subtly, an enabler of individuals who oppose such efforts. The Republican Party's record of maintaining Lincoln's commitment to freedom and equity had been inconsistent before in the face of political backlash and lagging electoral prospects, particularly in the 1870s, and the subsequent decades-long buildup of the Jim Crow South that stripped Black Americans of their citizenship rights and safety. But there had always remained a support for African American rights, even if more rhetorical than legislative, and at the very least, no active embrace of disenfranchisement and extralegal violence that was meted out against African Americans, right? The common practice among Democrats. The Republican Party's anti-slavery origins were at the heart of Frederick Douglass's description of the party in 1888, when he told a room of African Americans that the Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea. In early 1963, Elmer A. Carter brought that Douglass line to the attention of Rockefeller's advisor and speechwriter Hugh Morrow, as the governor prepared to give speeches at a couple of Lincoln Day dinners, which were annual Republican fundraisers. Carter was a Rockefeller ally and Black Republican who had served on the New York State Commission Against Discrimination for almost 20 years at that point. Carter encouraged Rockefeller to use the Lincoln Day speeches as an opportunity to reiterate his promise to preserve the Republican Party's commitment to civil rights. This was a pressing issue for Carter because he had received a letter from a lifelong Black Republican, George W. Lee of Memphis, Tennessee, warning of a racist agenda to usurp the Republican Party in the South. Lee explained, quote, "We are fighting a last-ditch battle in the South against great odds, and unless we get support from Northern interests, the Republican Party will be taken over lock, stock, and barrel by the Ku Kluxers, the John Birchers, and other extreme right-wing reactionaries," end quote. Lee explained that recent Republican gains in the South were the result of Democrats joining the Republican Party in an attempt to create an all-white party in the South that could counter the growing racial liberalism in the National Democratic Party. According to Lee, Republicans who adhered to, quote, "the true principles of the party," were concerned about the party's success in the South. For several years at that point, Republican leaders had worked on an effort called Operation Dixie to elect Republicans in the South. They had some success in the 1962 midterm elections, but Lee feared that these gains were contradictory to GOP principles, or what he called the progressive republicanism advocated by the Eisenhower administration. So in that 62 midterm election, the Republican Party gained House seats in Florida, Texas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, and demonstrated great strength in cities such as Dallas, Texas, which was unusual at the time. Lee said that allowing Democrats turned Republicans to transform the GOP into the first major all-white political party would be a mistake, and that the Republican Party could find success in 1964, if not in the South, in the industrial North, with Rockefeller as the standard bearer. The lifelong Republican hoped that with Rockefeller at its helm, the party would reject this segregationist strategy and embrace middle-of-the-road republicanism that could appeal to Black voters. Rather than share a candid account of the Republican Party's transformation in the South, as urged by Elmer Carter, Rockefeller gave more partisan speeches that presented his party as being in agreement about civil rights protections. Republicans at the dinners heard Rockefeller tout the Republican Party's foundation in a, quote, deep-rooted belief in and concern for equality and human dignity, end quote, and enumerate New York civil rights laws that were passed under former New York Governor Thomas Dewey and a Republican-controlled legislature. He also mentioned the passage of anti-discrimination laws related to private housing, commercial space, and job training during his own administration. Rockefeller went on to criticize Kennedy's reliance, President John F. Kennedy, on high publicity administrative actions such as the intervention in James Meredith's attempt to desegregate the University of Mississippi, instead of introducing new legislation or supporting bills introduced by Democratic members of Congress. He did not mention that the Republican Party was increasingly split on the issue of civil rights, like the Democratic Party. At this point in 1963, Rockefeller was often discussed as the presumed Republican presidential nominee, and with that in mind, he emphasized party unity. But once his lead in the polls declined in the summer of 1964, he took on his party directly and warned that the Republican Party was in danger of being subverted by extremists such as the John Birch Society and opponents of civil rights and desegregation. So this is, I keep forgetting, this is again, another angle of that photograph. So this is a Lincoln Day dinner that Rockefeller gave a year later in Oregon. And that one, he sort of actually cut out almost everything that mentioned civil rights at all in that 64 talk that he gave. So you can see how malleable a Lincoln Day dinner speech remains to this day, actually. The next February, and I should say it was in Medford, Oregon. In that speech, he no longer talked about civil rights as being an urgent issue for the Republican Party. Rockefeller maintained his support for federal civil rights protections, but after his loss of the 1964 presidential nomination and the rejection he faced at that year's Republican National Convention, he was famously booed and heckled when he called for the party to reject extremism. Rockefeller no longer took a leading position on civil rights in the state of New York. He continued to support efforts to build affordable and accessible housing, but when concerns about police misconduct and brutality and other inequalities in the criminal justice system arose, Rockefeller was conspicuously silent. When fellow Republican legislators accused African American women of stealing from the public welfare system, unsubstantiated claims that they had been making since the 1950s, Rockefeller would no longer defend the program or its recipients as he did during his first 2 terms in office. One of the most dramatic shifts in Rockefeller's position on issues related to civil rights arose in 1966, when he sought his 3rd term as governor. In the aftermath of the 1964 uprisings in Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Rochester, violence that broke out after a 15-year-old black teenager by the name of James Powell was shot and killed by a white police officer outside of the junior high school where he had been taking voluntary summer school classes. In response to the uprisings, the New York branches of the NAACP adopted a resolution calling for a 9-point program to end police brutality, create an independent civilian review board, and meet with Rockefeller to investigate and alleviate the conditions that led to the crisis in New York. Civil rights groups joined an ongoing effort to create a civilian review board in New York City, which had been proposed by a Democrat in the city council earlier in the year. In 1966, the newly elected mayor of New York City, John Lindsay, moved forward with his plan to appoint a new board with 4 civilians and 3 police officers, with the belief that they would be more receptive to investigating allegations of police misconduct and brutality waged against African Americans and Puerto Ricans. The Patrolmen's Benevolent Association and the New York Conservative Party organized a campaign against the Civilian Complaint Review Board. They succeeded in getting a referendum placed in the 1966 ballot to disband the Civilian Review Board. Opponents of the Civilian Complaint Review Board used scare tactics and misinformation to equate support for civilian review of the police with rising rates of crime and disorder, an argument also deployed by critics of the civil rights movement. The Civilian Complaint Review Board became a major point of contention, although it had little power and was largely a symbolic gesture made by liberal politicians who wanted to offer a diplomatic and harmless overture to the city's racial minorities. In the fall of 1966, the New York Times noted that the majority of the complaints heard by the new board came from whites who reported discourtesy, unnecessary force, and abuse of authority during their encounters with the police. In fact, whites filed more complaints than people from all other minority groups combined. The work of the review board revealed that police oversight was not a Black issue, or, as its critics claimed, an effort by racial minorities to commit crimes unchecked. As the battle over the Civilian Review Board intensified, New York's most prominent liberal leaders, including Lindsay and Javits and Robert Kennedy, supported the board, while Rockefeller did not. Privately, Rockefeller and his staff expressed support for civilian review, but candidate Rockefeller disassociated himself from what he began calling a local matter because it could hurt his campaign. Rockefeller's position on the Civilian Review Board was much discussed during his staff's strategy meetings throughout his campaign. In August 1966, Rockefeller agreed with an advisor who suggested he call the Civilian Review Board a local issue and express hope that the referendum would not become an occasion, it's a quote, for indulging prejudices against any minority or minorities. As the campaign progressed, however, Rockefeller maintained a neutral position that did not acknowledge what he admitted privately, that there were considerable problems in the relationship between the police and minority communities. Instead, he praised the police unreservedly and said the Civilian Review Board was beyond the scope of the governorship. Rockefeller's position, which one staff member referred to as embarrassing, another quote, was considered the safe choice because there was a strong backlash against the Civilian Complaint Review Board. But it did draw criticisms from Black communities in New York City. Rockefeller continued his traditional outreach to Black communities. He even launched his campaign that year in Harlem. But his position on the review board drove a wedge between the governor and longtime allies. And this is a photograph it's from August 9th, 1966 in the Bronx. So this was one of 4 appearances Rockefeller made that day to launch his campaign. And you see signs there were also hecklers there, but there were signs from protesters, right, with lines like, dogs have the ASPCA, what do people have? And you want votes, produce. Right, so what was supposed to be this, sort of positive and triumphant moment was less so. And there was, sort of ongoing debate amongst Rockefeller's assistants and aides about why this happened. Some claim that, some of his Black advisors like Jackie Robinson, who was working on his campaign, hadn't done enough to make sure that there weren't hecklers in the crowd, while other Black advisors, one named Wyatt T. Walker, argued that he hadn't paid enough attention to the policy issues that would have appealed to those groups and done that work, the policy work, right, that might make them more receptive to him appearing there in the community. Rockefeller's African-American allies, most prominent of them was Jackie Robinson, viewed the governor's praise for the police and refusal to more readily take a position on the review board as a failure of leadership. The editorial board of the New York Amsterdam News was unimpressed with the governor's decision to stay out of the issue. Although the Amsterdam News did not openly accuse the governor of siding with the opponents of the Civilian Review Board, it implied that such conclusions were possible. It would be unfortunate, stated the editorial board, if the governor would be accused of lying low on the review board issue in order to get the anti-review board vote in the city, end quote. Years after the campaign, Rockefeller said that he used his Democratic opponent Frank O'Connor's position on the review board, his support, as a way to refute his established record as a law and order man. I can see him now, recalled Rockefeller, parading up Fifth Avenue with John Lindsay, Bob Kennedy, and Jake Javits, together in support of what to me was obviously an unpopular, unsound concept, end quote. Rockefeller explained that the press tried to trap him with the CCRB, the review board, but he refused to get involved. Contemporaneous documents produced during the campaign, however, revealed that Rockefeller thought the review board was legitimate. The opponents of the Civilian Complaint Review Board prevailed on November 8, 1966. New York City residents voted 3-2 to disband the board. In response to the defeat, the NAACP announced that it would set up 4 offices and document civilians' complaints regarding police, take affidavits, and advise people on their options moving forward. Roy Wilkins explained, unlike the opponents of the board, the NAACP does not desire to create fear and hysteria over this issue. But we insist that adverse police attitudes toward and mistreatment of minorities are very real. They cannot be swept aside by an expensive advertising campaign based upon fear. So that was Roy Wilkins. With the success of the referendum, a symbolic fix was dismantled, and police were given the signal that they could patrol communities of color, in particular, with little to no opportunity for redress. If the Civilian Complaint Review Board had been the ultimate test of support for the civil rights movement, as John Lindsay had called it, Rockefeller failed. The referendum wasn't the only matter on the ballot, of course. With nearly 5.5 million votes cast and a heavy voter turnout, Rockefeller won his 3rd term in office by defeating Frank O'Connor by close to 400,000 votes. Rockefeller won the 1962 election by 520,000 votes. Overall, Rockefeller's decision not to campaign for the Civilian Review Board did not hurt him significantly with Black voters statewide. Statewide, Rockefeller won 34% of the Black vote, which was similar to his 1962 results, but a 1-point difference. But lower-income African Americans were less likely to support him than more financially secure Blacks. Rockefeller's calculation appeared to be a resounding success electorally, but it meant that Rockefeller's effort to align the Republican Party with the fight for Black citizenship rights in the 20th century had failed nationally and in New York. The Republican Party was more likely to be in opposition to civil rights activism than in partnership with it. Early in his political career, Rockefeller and his advisors looked at Republican efforts to court Southern segregationists and dismissed them as a form of extremism that would never make the party dominant nationwide. The 1966 election, however, demonstrated how a politician who saw himself as an advocate of civil rights could embrace anti-Black positions that may not have been warranted the label extreme, but disengage the GOP from efforts to construct and maintain safeguards that would allow multiracial democracy to flourish. After his 1968 presidential run, Rockefeller set aside his original premise for a Republican-led activist government that worked to protect the nation's most vulnerable, and instead fashioned a government that pitted members of the cross-class, bipartisan, multi-ethnic constituency he had cultivated against one another. One of the best ways to trace the transformation of Rockefeller's politics and style of governance, once he shed his plan to revive a party of Lincoln, is to look at his efforts to undermine the social safety net. At the end of the 1960s, Rockefeller announced that New York was in a grave fiscal crisis as aid to local municipalities had outstripped the state's revenues. He targeted AFDC, or aid to families with dependent children, for the brunt of his criticisms and eventual cuts. Rather than frame the rising costs of welfare as a legitimate but too great to bear expense, Rockefeller claimed that expenditures in this area had ballooned because of theft and welfare recipients' abuse of the state's generosity. He claimed, for example, that a considerable portion of the state's welfare recipients were newly arrived residents who came to New York from places like Mississippi to go on welfare, despite evidence to the contrary. He used the racially coded language popular in that era to present welfare as a Black program and a Black problem. In 1967, Rockefeller invited 100 of the nation's leaders in industry, labor, news media, philanthropy, and government, representing 14 states and 12 cities, to a conference commemorating the 100th anniversary of the New York State Board of Social Welfare. Rockefeller's hope was that the private sector would figure out how to fix the nation's welfare problem by making the current system more cost-effective and finding opportunities to employ welfare recipients, thus breaking the, quote, cycle of dependency. The logic behind the conference was straightforward, but the findings proved to be unexpected, or inconvenient, at least, to Rockefeller. Rather than propose slashing welfare spending or admonishing longtime recipients, the business-minded men determined that the nation must provide more financial assistance to the nation's poor, thus creating a political dilemma for Rockefeller. The conference attendees found that the welfare system had failed the majority of the nation's poor. Despite 81 months of consecutive economic growth, observed the participants, millions of people were living in poverty. Many of the conference participants recommended a guaranteed annual income as a solution, although they did see a need for programs targeted at children who receive welfare because they perceived them to be raised in an, quote, atmosphere of dependency and defeat. The final report, which was released 2 days before Rockefeller announced his 1968 presidential campaign, read, "The present system of public assistance does not work well. It is demeaning, inefficient, inadequate, and has so many disincentives built into it that it encourages continued dependency. It should be replaced with an income maintenance system, possibly a negative income tax." Rockefeller ignored the conference conclusion that the government and economy had left welfare recipients in an impossible situation in favor of a plan that, despite euphemistic rhetoric, framed welfare recipients as problems in need of repair. In a series of statements released during his presidential campaign, Rockefeller laid out his own program for welfare reform that placed the onus for poverty on the recipients themselves and focused on training them to be self-sufficient. After his loss in 1968, Rockefeller's criticisms became even more pointed and negative, and at times sensational. In 1969 and 1970, Rockefeller helped usher in significant cuts to welfare benefits paired with work requirements. A New York Times reporter called Rockefeller a principal architect of the welfare cuts. In 1970, which was also the year of Rockefeller's last re-election campaign, he proposed a controversial and possibly unconstitutional year-long residency requirement, a voluntary resettlement program to help recipients move to states where jobs and housing were available, and work incentives that included suspending local social services districts' authority to declare an individual unfit for employment. So that residency requirement would have made benefits. Any newcomer who had been to this, who had only lived in the state for up to a year, would be ineligible for benefits, right? Because he's making this case that it's newcomers that had caused this increase in the cost of the program. Rockefeller had vetoed a similar residency law in 1960. In support of the proposal, Rockefeller claimed that in-migration was a major factor in the state's fiscal crisis. But studies showed that only 11,000 of the state's 1.6 million residents who received welfare at the end of 1970 had lived in the state less than a year. The state's welfare reforms, which received bipartisan support, were based on the unproven premise that welfare recipients chose state aid over work out of laziness. During the congressional testimony the following year, Rockefeller admitted that a 6-month investigation of the state's 1.7 million people on welfare found only 152 cases of fraud, of which 21 were referred to the district attorney. a far cry from Rockefeller's repeated claim that 20% of recipients were on the rolls fraudulently. One cannot credit Rockefeller's 1970 reelection to his handling of welfare reform, but it was part of a broader effort by the governor to embrace conservative, culture war, and anti-urban issues that helped him to victory. During his first two campaigns, Rockefeller sought to build a coalition that prioritized civil rights protections. But he owed his 1970 success, similar to his 1966 campaign, to a de-emphasis of racial liberalism. Rockefeller lost New York City by a narrow 46 to 48% margin between himself and Democrat Arthur Goldberg. But he won Queens, expanding his victory margin from 3,000 votes in 1966 to almost 70,000 in 1970, and in Staten Island. Meanwhile, he maintained his strength in the suburbs of Long Island and Westchester and experienced a much larger advantage in upstate New York. Unlike in 1966, Rockefeller did see a considerable decline in support among Black voters. Part of the decline in Black support for Rockefeller was credited to the Democrats putting the first African American on the ticket for lieutenant governor, Basil Patterson. But his candidacy did not lead to an increased Black turnout, as some had predicted. Ultimately, Rockefeller won his largest victory margin, approximately 715,000 votes, matching Franklin Roosevelt's 1930 reelection record. New York Times journalist Richard Reeves observed, quote, when his regular private polls convinced him during his 1970 reelection campaign that he had to move to the right to survive, he did just that, joining the party of Dick Nixon, James Buckley, and all. It was something of a shock to Charles Goodell, welfare mothers, and other assorted liberals. But Rockefeller did what he had to do for political survival, end quote. In his 1968 campaign book, time here, almost done. In his 1968 campaign book, Unity, Freedom, and Peace, A Blueprint for Tomorrow, Rockefeller began by expressing his admiration for, not Lincoln, but another Republican icon, Theodore Roosevelt. In Roosevelt's presidency, Rockefeller found inspiration for his own campaign and drew attention to the ways in which they both shared in Lincoln's commitment to equality and a faith in the nation's institutions. A quote Rockefeller shared from Roosevelt introduced the logic for his campaign. The most timid rabbit alive is not afraid of a dead issue. It is only the live issues that make timid politicians run away and crooked politicians walk crookedly. It does not need any courage to take the right stand against slavery and secession when we speak of Lincoln, for the excellent reason that both slavery and secession are dead. But it takes real courage to apply Lincoln's teachings to the industrial and political conditions of the day, and therefore, only a man with some stuff in him will make the effort. It's Roosevelt. Rockefeller, of course, said he was prepared to apply Lincoln's principles to present-day problems. He noted that despite the nation's great wealth, quote, 30 million of our people still live in poverty, insecurity, and fear. He cited statistics about racial inequality as evidence of a need for new leadership. Another quote from the text, 12% of white Americans and 41% of Black Americans are not sharing in our ways of life, our American dream. Infant mortality rates are actually higher in the United States than in 10 other nations, especially among our Negro citizens, explained Rockefeller. He then argued that government should provide incentives for the business sector to address such human concerns, so more people could enjoy the American dream. Later in the chapter, after discussing a need for a new approach in Vietnam, Rockefeller wrote, quote, we cannot win the trust and confidence of continents of other colors until we honor our citizens descended of slaves, end quote. These were the tried and true themes that Rockefeller advanced throughout much of his career as the case for his electability. Rockefeller presented himself as the leader who could meet the example of Lincoln and Roosevelt, but his governorship did not hold up to his principles. Oh, sorry, I had that quote there too. Rockefeller was not alone in the choices that he made. His attacks on welfare, for example, would be embraced by numerous politicians on both sides of the aisle. A longtime Black supporter who worked for Rockefeller after working for Martin Luther King Jr., Wyatt T. Walker, concluded after Rockefeller's death that the governor had not changed at his core. The nation had. In his estimation, the whole nation had become conservative, and so too had Rockefeller's politics. Rockefeller's career and his failure to innovate as he had hoped is notable, not because he is the only politician who did not live up to his own rhetoric. One could say that's the entirety of politics. Rockefeller's trajectory is worth greater attention, however, because his lofty goals for the nation became a baser form of politics that says one can only thrive if your neighbor languishes. The New York governor serves as a reminder that leadership matters and that the degradation of his form of moderate republicanism and a more general disengagement from the fight for civil rights in the United States has cascading negative outcomes that continue to unfold. Thank you.